I want to suggest to you that we've done this before. So here's the second thing I want to talk about. You know, the problems that we've had in the last couple of years are not as bad as ones that we've had before. And I'm not talking about the Great Depression. I'm talking about the 1980s. All right? And so in order to do this, let's go back to the 1970s. How many people in here come from farm families? A lot of people here. I was in Elmwood Park, Illinois last night. Nobody raised their hand. All right? And I'm like, I don't know how many generations they are away, but you know, but there's a lot of hands. So do you guys remember? I know you remember. What were they saying about farmland back in the 70s? What were you saying? God ain't making any more farmland. What were bankers saying? God ain't making any more farmland. Farmland prices will never go down. Crop prices will never go down. By the way, what were they saying about oil? Oil prices will never go down. We're about to run out of all of it. Jimmy Carter went on TV, 1977, said it's over. We had no more oil. Turn down your thermostat to 55. The world's over. Just get used to it. Boy, was he wrong. You know, Thomas Malthus said that we'd run out of food back in 1798. He's wrong, and he's dead. That makes him dead wrong. You know, Jimmy Carter wrong. He's still alive. So, but someday he'll be dead wrong too. But the bottom line is that it was all wrong. But you know, you ever heard of Penn Square Bank? Started in a little strip mall in Oklahoma City. They started making oil loans like crazy. Just like a lot of farm banks were making farm loans like crazy, because it was a no-brainer, because farm prices were never going to go down again and oil prices were never going to go down again, just like 5 years ago, house prices were never going to go down again. And by the way, the reason all this happened, see the blue line? The blue line is the Federal Reserve's interest rate. The red line is the natural rate. Back in the 60s and 70s, they kept holding interest rates too low. And whenever they do that, bad stuff happens. And so we had too much lending in ag, too much lending in oil, and guess who does oil and ag? Well, you got Texas or Oklahoma, you know, but what I mean is Latin America. So all the biggest banks in this country had hundreds of percentage points of their capital lent to Latin America. And every single Latin American country eventually defaulted on its debt. And in the early 1980s, farms were going broke left and right. You remember it. Taking banks down with them. Oil collapsed, took Penn Square down, Continental Bank in Chicago, Seafirst Bank in Seattle, took them down. Latin America all defaulted on its debt. Every single money center bank in this country, big bank in this country, was defunct, bankrupt. Our problems, our banking problems in the early 1980s were bigger than the problems we had 3 years ago. I mean, I could prove it to you, but I don't want to bore you with all the numbers. But it was about 6% of GDP back then. It's only been about 3 to 4% of GDP in the last couple of years. What's different, the difference between today, or the last few years, our crisis now, and the crisis back in the early 1980s, is that we have mark-to-market accounting, or we just changed it a little bit. But mark-to-market accounting today, when we didn't have it back then. Now, I want to just spend 1 minute on mark-to-market accounting. Some of you are going, what is mark-to-market accounting? All right? Well, mark-to-market accounting means that you take the market price of stuff, no matter what it is, and you have to mark a bank down to that market price. So back in the early 1980s, Latin American debt was only worth 10 cents on the dollar. And that meant all those money center banks were bankrupt. But you know what we did back then? We didn't have mark-to-market accounting. So we said, you know what, don't mark it down, don't go out of business. Let's see if we can fix this problem. And we gave it time. We gave it time to work out. And guess what? All that debt eventually got paid back, and those banks weren't forced to go bankrupt. We didn't spend any government money supporting them. We didn't have a TARP plan, a PPIP, a TAL, FATIF, FADU, you know, all those things. We just said, wait a minute, bankers, calm down. Everybody hold on. Let's give this some time. Okay, and then eventually 6-7 years into the problem, we said that's it, time's out, and we started the RTC, and that's when we took over all those savings and loans and wound them down, and everything was okay. And in the midst of the 80s, in the midst of this huge banking problem where 2,800 banks failed, I want to put this into context. This past year, we've lost 98 banks. At the most, we're going to lose 400 banks in this crisis. Back in the 80s and 90s, 2,800 banks and savings and loans went belly up. That problem was way worse. Now, let me give you a mark-to-market example about what happened in this last couple of years. Imagine you lived in a house in the hills above Santa Barbara, California. You've been reading about forest fires out there, right? Maybe even somebody has a house out there. It's $1 million house. You got a $600,000 mortgage on this house. And there's a forest fire 2 miles to your east. And the Santa Ana winds are blowing. You know, they're coming up over the mountains and they're blowing the fire 2 miles away from your house. 60-mile-an-hour winds. Forest fires, huge. Got a $600,000 mortgage on $1 million house. And the banker knocks on your door and says, you know what, we got to mark you to market. What do you think the bid is on your house right now? What do you think your house is worth? Well, if you put it up for bid, you might get $50,000. I mean, remember, it's about to get destroyed by fire. And the banker says, you know what, it's only worth $50,000. You have a $600,000 mortgage. You got to come up with $550,000 right now, or I got to take your house. You're bankrupt. That's what mark-to-market accounting is. It forces you to mark assets to market in the middle of a firestorm. And that's what we did last year. That's what happened to Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Washington Mutual, Wachovia, all of those banks. They were literally, our government, I believe, compounded the problems that Alan Greenspan made with low interest rates with this stupid accounting rule, and the combination of that created a catastrophe. So when anybody tells you, oh, it's a failure of capitalism, it wasn't. It was a failure of government.